Okay. So this is just a snapshot that NARA was planning for several years about the uh, up at that point in time the upcoming October 26, 2017 deadline. So in January of 2014, they put together the Special Access and Freedom of Information Act staff, assembled a team, and what they did was they basically scanned all the records that had redactions or withheld in full, and then they decided which agencies had equities or would be the ones that have to make decisions about declassification because NARA has no authority. And then from the end of 2014 to the middle of 2015, they sent out letters to the various agencies that they had identified saying that, hey, we're going to release these records on October 26, 2017, unless you object and the president agrees with your objection. And NARA apparently had some meetings over the next year and a half to facilitate these discussions. They went nowhere. I don't know what point NSC got involved, but certainly by February of 2017, then NARA sends up follow-up letters to the agency saying, hey, these records are going to be released unless you do something. And then in May of 2017, the NSC has its first official involvement where it actually develops processing guidelines for the act. You get the next slide, Bob? Okay, so this is an excerpt from this is the draft, this is the document that the National Security Council drafted. This was to be used by all the agencies that have records, equities, and records that are postponed. And this is essentially, starting with number 2, this is the procedure and the substantive criteria that the NSC said the agencies were to use to comply with the act. Now, I have some highlighting, but then I have a couple of asterisks or yellow marks next to some particularly pertinent portions. So the supporting documentation, which is 2A Roman numeral 2, if you look within there, there's three criteria for postponement. One is the statutory postponement criteria. 2 is something they just made up out of thin air. The impact of disclosure on current agency and department operations. That is nowhere in the statute. Somehow they decided that was going to be a criterion. And then there was number 3 was an aspirational goal of a proposed date when a verifiable event when the record could be released. And Chad, this is where I think the origins of the transparency plans first started. So this was a May 2017 document. Bob, next slide. So this is a continuation. Roman numeral 3 is the statutory criteria. Now what they're doing here is they're putting flesh to there's 5 or 6 criteria within the statute. And they're putting flesh to what these criteria mean. So one of the grounds you can see the highlighted is there has to be identifiable harm to military defense, intelligence operations, law enforcement, or the conduct of foreign relations. So those are the 4 categories that allows for postponement under Section 5G2D. Now, just to take a step back, when the agencies were dealing with the ARB, they were using Section 6, which is where the clear and convincing evidence requirement was, and it was a little more detailed than 5G2D. But somewhere along the line, the government decided that when the ARB went out of business, or when for purposes of reviewing previously redacted documents that were going to be subject for possible disclosure on October 26, 2017, suddenly Section 6 disappears. And that the only criteria, those that are in Section 5G2D. Interestingly enough, the transparency plans that were approved under Biden make reference to Section 6. So there's an inconsistent treatment here. But anyway, so now what they're doing is they're providing some flesh to what does it mean that you could have an identifiable harm to military defense. And you'll notice that they've changed identifiable harm. They've now said sufficient gravity. So it just says identifiable harm is of such gravity. Now, it's a little tweak, sufficient gravity. But to me, the way I read that as a lawyer, that was a lowering of the standard. Such gravity is to me, a higher standard is sufficient gravity. So you'll see that sufficient gravity is throughout these subcategories. Bob, get the next slide. Okay. Again, we're talking about, well, go back for a second. So we're intelligence operations. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So these are the subcategories for identifiable harm within the intelligence operations criteria category that are grounds for postponement. And not only do they have sufficient gravity throughout, but they added a Roman numeral 8. So it says identifiable harm to intelligence operation caused by disclosure of any other matter currently relating to intelligence operations. Again, this is like they just pulled this out of thin air. So Section 6 was basically the basis for these first 7 subcategories. And then Section 8 was like a catch-all. So if it's not covered by one of these specific things, then any matter that's currently relating to intelligence operations, if it has sufficient gravity to outweigh public interest to such disclosure. So that's like you could drive a truck through that exception. I mean, this was like a catch-all exclusion. Then for law enforcement, they don't comply with the act because the act requires not just that the person is a living, but that disclosure of their information would cause them physical harm. And they completely eliminate that from this criteria. So this is for the FBI, the DEA, and the DOJ. So when they're looking at their records, and this is particularly about the mafia, the mere disclosure of an informant's name, if they're still living, who provided confidential information, they're saying that's grounds for postponement when the statute says, and disclosure would cause imminent harm to them. But they deleted that. Next slide. So this is the foreign affairs section. And again, they have this Romanet 5, where the catch-all, which is disclosure of any other matter currently relating to the conduct of foreign affairs. I mean, yeah, Japan could get pissed at us for some reason, that we're releasing a document. That's enough in this category to say, I want to postpone the disclosure. Now, number 3 now provides that when the agency completes its review, and it has documents it wants to postpone, it would submit this postponement request to the National Security Council. Notice what it says. May seek input from NARA regarding the request, including requesting an explanation as to why NARA concurs with or recommends against certain parts of the requested continued postponement. So the NSC is the ultimate arbitrator in terms of determining if the record is to be released or not. They may consult with NARA, and in fact, as you'll see in a moment, they basically ask NARA to give them cover for all their decisions. But the NSC just assumed the responsibility. They basically took over, in their mind, the authority to make final decisions. Nothing in the statute that authorizes the National Security Council to make this decision. Next slide. Now, this is I just added this because this is the Joint Chief of Staff basically saying they have no records that they're objecting to being released. Well, probably because they destroyed all of them. But this is April 27th of 2017. Yeah, next slide, Bob. Okay, so now we're up to July, and this is an email from William Bosanko, who is the head of NARA, to David Ferrara, who was then the archivist. And Bosanko was telling him that we're getting some really inconsistent reviews that are not only inconsistent with the statute, but also with prior decisions made by the ARB and the expectations of the ARB. And he's thinking perhaps some of this is through the loss of personnel, but he says at the end, we are just starting to see these decisions. We are also hard pressed to provide informed recommendations to NSC, NSS. So they're looking for, the NSC is at this point asking NARA's blessing on any postponements. NARA has essentially assumed a ARB-like role in this process. They don't necessarily, the NSC doesn't have to obtain NARA's consent or approval, but they want it for cover purposes. Now, the blackout there is, that's one of the FOIA exceptions. So don't know what is being discussed there. We tried to get this unredacted, but we were unsuccessful. Next slide. So this is now August of 2017. And this is now what's happening here. We have Gary Stern has written a draft memo to the NSC providing NARA's concerns about the reviews by the CIA and the FBI. So here's an internal element, internal email showing that. So apparently it looks like James Mathis actually took the first stab at it. He gave it to Mark DeMurphy. Then it went to Gary Stern, who's the in-house counsel at National Archives. And then they sent the drafts over. And the top email is from William Bosanko, who's the head of the CIA, the NARA, sending it to John Fitzpatrick. He is the guy that was tasked at the NSC to shepherd this process through to conclusion. So William Bosanko is sending him a draft of the objections that NARA has. Again, this is all part of a collaborative process. Next slide. So we don't know who this was sent to, but note at the bottom that whoever it was sent to, I believe this is someone at the FBI. You'll see that they are saying, William Bosanko is saying that NARA is concerned the FBI did not apply the standards of review necessary under the JFK Act. This is in August 21 of 2017. Next slide. So this is an explanation as part of this email was later on as to what NARA is objecting to. And you can see that they're saying that, the FBI is relying on broad statements about possible stigmatization, harassment, or even violent retribution. NARA is saying bullshit, 50 years, there's only some residual privacy element. And then they're saying that the standard under the Act and the ARB standard was that it was a very high standard. There had to be clear and convincing evidence of a substantial risk of harm. And that any invasion of privacy is so substantial that it outweighs the public interest. Barring specific document-level justifications, NARA recommends this type of this appeal be denied. So, and it goes on to say this is about the mafia, the La Castronosa files, LCN. Some of the sources being protected are in the main investigative case files for Jack Ruby, Oswald, and the JFK assassination, because the intent was to release documents 50 years or over, and these files clearly relate directly to the assassination. NARA opposes the continued postponement of any confidential source information, barring the clear and convincing evidence of a substantial risk of harm. They ended up having to basically fall on their sword for this, but this was their objection, and it was never resolved. Next slide. This is a continuation of that email. So just actually, this is part of a letter. So that what you saw in the email was then memorialized in the letter. And again, this just repeats. I probably should have not included this. You'll see of the 7,469 files that FBI appealed, 6,097 of them were mafia files. So they were definitely, there's something about the mafia in the FBI documents that they're holding back on. And the FBI was, contrary to common belief, FBI was the worst offender during the ARB process of challenging ARB decisions. And they obviously were continuing through the 2017 process. Next slide. So this is a letter written, no, this is the letter from William Bosanko to John Fitzpatrick, and this is about they're objecting to the CIA postponements. And they're saying that the significant volume of the CIA's proposed withholdings are not consistent with the JFK Act and prior determinations of the ARB. So we are concerned with inconsistencies in how CIA treated information they've identified as requiring postponement. So this is just, again, the NARA is trying. They are trying to get these documents released. Next slide. So this is an excerpt, same day, Bosanko sends a letter to Fitzpatrick about the FBI files. And again, you'll see NARA is concerned the FBI did not apply the standards of review necessary under the Act. So this is simply a repeat of the email that I shared with you earlier, but now this is being sent to Fitzpatrick, who now, he's Senior Director, Records Access and Information Security Management, and it's his job then to go to the FBI now and try to work out these objections. Next slide. Okay. So this is now the end of August, and this is Department of Defense. So again, they are objecting to the concerns. They're objecting to most. They're not objecting to requests for postponement by OSD, but the rest of the components they are. And again, John Fitzpatrick, John Powers, Gregory Cox. These are all people that were involved in the process, and their names are everywhere. It's interesting how some of the names are redacted and some aren't. It may be that the redacted names were contractors, were not employees. I don't know, but the names are definitely, those are employee-based, employee identification postponements. Next slide. So these are the objections that NARA had to the Department of Defense postponements. So some of these are interesting. So the Army, I don't know what INSCOM is, but they have concerns that these fail to meet the standard under the Act. There are intercepts by NSA. NSA is objecting to some of them. 188 are okay, but the rest they were objecting to. And where was the one? Oh, and then below that it says for documents, some documents they're seeking postponement of information that's already been released. So there was some messiness along the way too. But these are again, NARA at the end of August is still objecting. Now they're objecting to the Department of Defense request for postponement. Next slide. Okay, so this is now there is a October 20, no, September 27th. There are a number of drafts circulating at this point in time for a presidential executive order to post.
Hey, Larry.
Yeah.
INSCOM stands for the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command.
Oh, okay. So at the end of September, there is already a draft. There have been about a dozen, well, half a dozen drafts at this point of an executive order to be signed by the president postponing the records. What they need is a memo from the archivist requesting the president to postpone the records. So what we're having here now is a draft, NARA drafted after pressure. They drafted a memo for review by National Security Council of a memo to the president requesting postponements. Next slide. And so this is now Ferrara has signed off on this letter, on this memo, and obviously everyone else has reviewed it, and now they're going to send it off to the National Security Council for their approval. Next slide. So now October 13th, the National Security Council calls for all hands on deck meeting at looks like the executive office building. Notice that, so this is now John Fitzpatrick asking those designated as senior agency officials under the executive order that pertains to national security records, who have made requests for postponement, they have to have their deputies to participate in these groups. Now, there had been prior small groups on September 7th and September 14th, but this was like an all hands on, we got to get these things resolved because time is running short. The meeting will continue discussions with about agency implementation to include the previously discussed possibility of a short-term postponement. We will discuss the possibility. There are some documents among agency requests that can be certified under Section 5 of the order. So they're at this point already discussing, started in September, but now on October 13th, which is 13 days away from the deadline, they're having an all-hands-on meeting to discuss a postponement. This is October 13th. Next slide. So now this is yet another version of a memo, which apparently National Security Council had some comments that they, again, this is the memo from the archivist to the president authorizing postponement or recommending postponement. So someone have something to say? Huh? Okay. So apparently National Security Council had comments to that memo, and now, and again, I was unable to get the underlying draft because it's technically deliberative review. If we had just gone into discovery, I probably could have gotten it, but they may have fought us under maybe even attorney-client privilege. But there's a back and forth going on between NARA and the National Security Council about what the memo is going to say to the president about the postponements. Next slide. So this is later that day, and notice that the NSC Legal Counsel requested changes. I was interpreting this as there was the grounds for postponement were being argued about. And so the Sanko is saying to Gary Stern, General Counsel, we say there's not enough time, but we do not ask for it. In other words, we're not going to say that we don't have enough time to process the records. So they're someone's trying to take the blame. Someone wants someone to take the blame for why they have to be a postponement here. And so far, it looks like they're trying to get the National Archives to be the one that makes the request that they don't have enough time. Next slide. Okay, this is John Fitzpatrick. This is October 13th, the next day. Notice the highlighted from Greg. Greg Koch is in the, he's another person that's in the NSC. And notice Benjamin Richardson is from the Department of Defense. And notice what he's telling the Department of the NSC. DOD has submitted more records to be withheld. I need to know that the status of these records to determine whether to have DOD leadership engage the White House. So this is the first sign that the Department of Defense is going to go to Trump and try to overrule any denials of any postponements. This is October 13th. Next. Later that day. So Greg is asking Ben in response to his letter, before you get to that question, i.e., whether the DOD secretary is going to go to talk to the White House, we need to we need your take on whether the issue identified in correspondence from NARA can be addressed in the time frame at hand. They're trying to avoid having the Secretary of Defense walk into the White House and ask for postponement. And so they're trying to figure out, is there some language we can agree on to avoid this? Next slide. October 17th. You'll see that Benjamin has notified, wait, is this Benjamin? No, this is from Donna Rivera, another one over at the Department of Defense. She's saying for the Department of Defense has submitted a petition to the White House for the president on October 20th. Well, we'll be doing it on the 20th. And then on behalf of Mr. Richardson, who I guess is her boss, and the Department of Defense, we respectfully request you revise your list of postponed records in part that the president can confidently certify under Section 5. So they're basically saying, we are submitting our petition. I don't know why she said the 20th when it's Tuesday the 17th. But they're basically saying that unless they revise it, they're going to go to the White House. Next slide. October 18th. So Bosanko is responding to Department of Defense, and they're basically saying that we are not in a position to support adding more postponements. And they're still trying to do the job of having maximum release under the statute. Next slide. Okay, now here's an example of what I was saying before about how bureaucrats talk to each other. So this is from William Bosanko to Benjamin Richardson. He's the guy at Department of Defense that they've been dealing with. We have not worked together, but I have been involved in D-Class for 20 plus years and have extensive experience working with DoD components and such issues. And he's letting him know that, they can offer numerous examples where he has been actually very helpful to the Department of Defense when it comes to declassification stuff. He said, I don't want you thinking that NARA is over here trying to substitute our judgment for DOD's. We just want to make sure, we want you to make decisions informed by what we know based on the broader JFK collection and what has been released, otherwise been released at NARA. This should not be about authorities, but rather about getting the decisions right. So they're basically, he's trying to tell them, I'm not trying to be difficult here. We're trying to help you, but by the same token, he could have been saying, guys, you're wrong. We are NARA. We know what the statute says, but they're being nice and saying, hey, we're not trying to second guess you. We're not trying to, to do your job for you. But they could have said that. They could have said, that you're just not, we're not going to agree to this. But they are basically bending over backwards to maintain a relationship with someone. Actually, he hasn't even worked with this person very much. So he's trying to create a good relationship with this guy from the Department of Defense, knowing that he's going to have other stuff he's going to have to deal with this person down the road. Next slide. October 20th. So here is this is NARA's markup of the president's executive order for the president to sign to certify postponement of the records. Note the date, October 20th. Next slide. October 21st, President Trump issues a tweet. The long and blocked class of JFK records to be opened. He has no idea that the day before there was a memo circulating about the records being postponed. Next slide. October 25th, day before the deadline. So this is an email that became a memo at the bottom underneath the asterisks, which was the email this was the memo from the archivist to the National Security Council recommending a postponement. And you'll see that it was 120 days originally. Now, they're talking about, can this be done in 90 days? And so the Ferrara is saying we can't do it in 90 days because it's 29,000 records. So Jay is just coming up with 120 days, but they expect the president to give them between 6 and 9 months. So they're asking for 120, but they realize the president is going to probably extend the deadline much beyond that, postpone it longer. But that's just the what's below in the bottom is this is the justification. So this was the justification that allowed the National Security Council to recommend to the president to postpone the records for another few months. They got this from NARA. So NARA now is supporting a temporary postponement of records. Next slide. So records are released, I think, on December 17th. And this is an email from William Pasecco to the FBI and other people they worked with. And he's letting them know that they didn't kind of like highlight the FBI, the CIA in the reason for postponements or the fact that there are some records that were destroyed. They didn't mention any agencies. They're letting them know they're being good people in the sandbox. And it turns out there were records they thought were destroyed, may not be destroyed, and they were destroyed, FBI records. They were destroyed in a flood in 2011. Next slide. So this is the email, this is about, so these are FBI records that were destroyed in the flood. And so they're just confirming that these records have been destroyed. Next slide. This is the press release that announced the release of the records that were released, and that there are more records that were going to be released. National Archives will release additional records in 2018 based on the outcome of reviews conducted pursuant to the president's direction. The next slide. These are where the transparency plans are. You'll see that each agency has transparency plans. I'm skipping ahead now to current times. So the Department of Defense has a transparency plan, CIA, Department of State, and the FBI. So if you go to the agency postponement documentation on the website, you can see the transparency plans for each of these agencies. I didn't include the NARA one because it would have made this way too small, and it really wasn't relevant. to our concerns because it was really about Social Security numbers. And then to follow in the next slide. So this is an acknowledgement by the media, June 30th, 23, that the National Archives says they're done. The president's done, and the National Archives is done. They've concluded their review of classified records related to the assassination of President Kennedy. So the archivist is supposed to make a certification to Congress that all the work required under the act has been completed, and there's been no certification to Congress. There's been no report to Congress. So this is, in my mind, an illegal and improper decision that the act has been terminated. So I believe that's the last slide, Bob, right? Yep. So that's just for that. So what I shared to you was just 2017. I have a whole batch from 2018. But that gives you kind of a flavor of the way the NSC was running the show and how NARA was trying its best to maximize disclosure, and at the end was forced to fall on its sword and come up with the recommendation to postpone. And I have actually in one of the productions from 2018 where they do the 3.5 years, there's a note from Ferrara saying the president's going to have to live with this date because they're really pissed off that the records were extended, postponed for that long period of time. So it's 8:20. Anyone have any comments, thoughts, or we can talk about more, or we can hang up and end the session. Stunned?
I noticed all those redactions of recipients, in the emails. I mean, there was one that said, "Dear John and Carrie." Well, John was obviously John Fitzpatrick, and then Carrie was one of the redactions. I read it. I mean, do they do that stuff a lot? It's really, it doesn't inspire very much confidence that they know what they're doing.
Yeah, so there were 10 different productions that were in my lawsuit, and there are different people that do the reviews, and I've had some disclosures where the person's email was included, and then there's usually multiple copies of the email, because there maybe someone's looking at CIA documents and someone's looking at Department of Defense, and other times their entire name is blacked out. There's no consistency. The frustrating thing is the underlying documents. I'd love to see the initial drafts of the executive order, and I'd love to see the initial draft of the recommendation from the archivist to the president. But they Freedom of Information Act is not a very strong. It's strong in some areas, but it's got a lot of exemptions.
But didn't you say earlier that you, I mean, in an earlier podcast that you had heard, I guess, that there were 9 drafts of this.
There were a dozen drafts of one of the Trump orders, and a little less than that for the second Trump order. But you could see it saying draft. You can see it says draft X or 5 or 6, whatever. I don't have the actual document, but I can see the header saying draft 5 or draft 6 or whatever.
Yeah. So, but those drafts, they're under wraps, right? That's what you're saying. That's not.
Yes. They're not. They're excluded under the Freedom of Information Act, and if I tried to get them, and they also argued since the National Security Council is part of the president's, it's presidential